She's 23 years old, standing on a beach of gray shingle at the edge of the world, and the ship that brought her here is already turning back toward open water. Wrangel Island, 100 miles of frozen rock and tundra north of Siberia, closer to nowhere than almost anywhere else on Earth. Four young men stand beside her, full of confidence and borrowed maps. She is the only woman. She did not want to come. Her name is Ada Blackjack, and in less than 2 years, she will be the only one left alive. But right now, on September 16th, 1921, she doesn't know any of that. She only knows that she needs the money, that her son is sick back in Nome, and that this strange expedition, funded by a man who isn't even here, has promised her wages no one else would pay an Inupiat woman raising a child alone. What happens to her over the next 23 months will become one of the most staggering survival stories of the 20th century. And almost nobody remembers her name. Let's fix that. Ada Blackjack was born in 1898 in a small settlement near Solomon, Alaska. Her Inupiat name was Ada Delatuk. Life had not been gentle with her. She married young, to a man who was, by most accounts, unkind to her. 2 of her children died in infancy. When her marriage collapsed, she was left alone in Nome with her surviving son, Bennett, a boy suffering from tuberculosis, needing medicine and care she could barely afford. She was not an outdoors woman. She was not a hunter. She could sew, and she could cook, and she had grown up around dog sleds and cold winters, but she had never learned the deep wilderness skills that Arctic survival actually demanded. She wanted, more than anything, to send Bennett to a hospital in Seattle. When she heard that an expedition to Wrangel Island needed a seamstress, needed someone to mend furs and cook meals for a crew of young explorers, she said yes. She had no idea what she was walking into. The expedition was the brainchild of a man named Vilhjalmur Stephenson, a famous Arctic explorer with a theory that Wrangel Island could become a strategic outpost, maybe even a new frontier for settlement. He believed, wrongly and dangerously, that the Arctic could sustain small parties indefinitely if they simply knew how to live off the land the way native Arctic peoples did. He wasn't on the island himself. He was thousands of miles away, arranging funding and headlines, sending 4 young men in his place. Alan Crawford, Lorne Knight, Fred Maurer, Milton Gali, none of them older than 28. Adventurous, a little naive, thrilled at the idea of claiming a remote island and making their names in the process. They needed a cook. They needed someone who could sew waterproof boots and repair fur parkas. They found Ada. She almost didn't go. Something about the whole plan unsettled her. But Bennett needed a hospital, and this job paid better than anything else available to her. So she boarded the ship anyway, carrying a small sewing kit and a photograph of her son. When the ship pulled away from Wrangel Island that September, leaving the 5 of them on the shore with a stockpile of supplies meant to last a year, Ada watched it shrink into the horizon and felt something close to panic. She was alone with 4 men she barely knew, on an island where the temperature would soon drop low enough to freeze exposed skin in minutes. There would be no way to leave until the ice let ship back in, if it ever did. The first months were almost pleasant in a strange way. The men hunted, Ada cooked and mended, and the island's summer birds and driftwood gave them enough to work with. They built a small cabin, played cards in the evenings, kept journals. Crawford, the group's young leader, wrote enthusiastically about claiming the island for the British Crown. Lorne Knight, older and more experienced, kept a steady record of the weather and the wildlife. For a while, it almost felt like an adventure worth having. Then the ice came in that fall, thick and unbroken, sealing the island off from the world exactly as they'd been told it might. That was expected. What wasn't expected was how the animals seemed to vanish with it. The seals that usually populated the coastline grew scarce. The polar bears, unpredictable and dangerous even in good years, appeared and disappeared without warning. Hunting, which was supposed to keep them fed through the winter, became a gamble the men lost more often than they won. By the time the sun disappeared for the long Arctic night, their food stores were already thinner than anyone wanted to admit. Ada wasn't just the cook anymore. She was watching the supplies dwindle with the same anxious eyes as everyone else, doing the arithmetic in her head, wondering how far a shrinking sack of flour could really stretch. Winter didn't just bring cold and hunger. It brought isolation of a kind almost impossible to describe to anyone who hasn't lived through months of darkness. The sun set in November and didn't return until the following year. The wind screamed across the tundra outside their small cabin walls, and somewhere out there, in that black and frozen dark, polar bears moved without sound, capable of tearing through a canvas tent in seconds. Ada had never been trained for any of this. She had signed on as a seamstress. Now she was learning, out of necessity, how to load a rifle, how to check a trap line, how to survive. She struggled. The men, exhausted and hungry themselves, sometimes lost patience with her. She was homesick, terrified, and increasingly aware that she had made a decision that might cost her everything. At one point, she even asked to be taken off the island when a resupply attempt seemed possible. It never came. The ice held firm. The promised relief ship never made it through, and Ada Blackjack remained trapped with 4 men on an island that was slowly starving all of them. Spring of 1922 should have brought relief. It didn't. The hunting stayed poor. The relief ship that was supposed to arrive with fresh supplies never showed up at all, blocked by ice that refused to break. As the second winter closed in, the 5 of them faced a truth none of them wanted to say out loud. They were going to have to survive an entire additional year on an island that had barely fed them through the first. That's when things started to fall apart. Lorne Knight, the most experienced outdoorsman among them, began showing strange symptoms. His gums bled. His joints ached in a way that had nothing to do with the cold. It was scurvy, the ancient enemy of every ship and expedition that had ever run short of fresh food, and there was no way to treat it on an island with no citrus, no fresh vegetables, nothing but what they could hunt and what remained of their dwindling stores. He grew weaker through the fall of 1922. The other men tried to hunt enough to keep him alive, tried rationing what fresh meat they could find in his direction, but scurvy doesn't care about good intentions. It eats away at the body from the inside, and by January of 1923, Lorne Knight could no longer walk. The 3 other men made a desperate decision. If they stayed on the island, all of them might die together when the food finally ran out completely. If 3 of them tried to cross the frozen sea to Siberia, over 100 miles of shifting, unstable pack ice, they might reach help and bring back a rescue. Crawford, Maurer, and Gal set out across the ice in January of 1923, leaving Ada behind to care for Lorne Knight, who was now too sick to move. They were never seen again. No one knows exactly what happened to them. The ice in that stretch of ocean is treacherous even for experienced polar travelers, prone to sudden fractures that can open a chasm of freezing water beneath a person's feet without warning. Most historians believe the 3 men fell through the ice or were carried out to sea on a breaking floe, swallowed by the Arctic Ocean somewhere between Wrangel Island and the Siberian coast. Their bodies were never found. Their fate remains, to this day, one of the enduring mysteries of Arctic exploration. And Ada Blackjack was alone with a dying man in a cabin at the edge of the world. Picture it. The wind outside never really stops. The daylight in January barely exists. Just a thin gray smear on the horizon for an hour or two before the dark swallows everything again. Inside the small cabin, a fire struggling against the cold, and a man who can no longer sit up, whose body is failing in slow, agonizing stages, and who knows, the way dying people sometimes know, that no one is coming. Ada nursed Lorne Knight for weeks. She hunted birds when she could, fed him what little she managed to catch, kept the fire going, kept talking to him even when he could barely respond. She had never wanted this responsibility. She had never asked to be the last capable person on an island slowly consuming everyone who set foot on it. But there was no one else, and so she did it anyway. He died in June of 1923. Ada Blackjack was now completely alone on Wrangel Island. Stop and sit with that for a second. Not alone in the way a person feels alone in a crowded city, or lonely in an empty house with electricity and neighbors down the street. Alone on a frozen island 100 miles from the nearest coastline, with no radio, no way to signal anyone, no certainty that a ship would ever come back for her at all. The 3 men who left for Siberia were gone. The man she'd nursed for months had just died in front of her. She had to bury him herself, in ground so frozen it barely allowed for a grave. And she still had to survive. This is the part of the story that turns Ada Blackjack from a footnote into something extraordinary. Because most people, faced with that kind of isolation and grief, might have simply given up. She didn't. She taught herself to shoot more accurately. She set traps for foxes, learning through trial and error which methods worked in the shifting Arctic terrain. She built a small platform to keep her food stores away from scavenging animals. She kept a journal, writing down her days in plain, aching language, recording not just what she ate, but what she feared. She was terrified of the polar bears that occasionally wandered near the cabin, terrified of the isolation eating away at her mind the same way scurvy had eaten away at Lorne Knight's body. There's a detail from her journals that sticks with people who learn this story. She wrote about building a kind of barricade around her sleeping area at night, worried that a bear might break in while she slept, and about the sound of the wind against the walls of the cabin, a sound she had to learn to live inside of month after month without another human voice to answer it. She thought of her son constantly. Bennett, waiting for her back in Nome, the reason she'd come on this expedition in the first place. She later said that thinking of him was what kept her moving through the worst of it, that giving up wasn't an option because somewhere a boy was waiting for his mother to come home. Through the summer of 1923, she hunted, fished, and gathered what she could, building a small stockpile in case winter arrived before rescue did. She had watched 3 trained, capable men vanish into the ice, and she had watched a 4th die slowly in front of her. She had every reason to believe she might be next. But she wasn't. On August 28, 1923, a ship appeared on the horizon. It was the schooner Donaldson, sent by Vilhjalmur Stephenson after growing concern about the expedition's prolonged silence. The men aboard had no idea what they would find when they reached the island. Some had likely braced for the worst, for an empty camp, for evidence of a tragedy with no survivors at all. Instead, they found Ada Blackjack, alive, thin, weathered, having spent weeks alone with nothing but her own resourcefulness standing between her and the same fate that had claimed the 4 men who came with her. She had survived nearly 2 years on Wrangel Island, the last several months of it completely alone. When she returned to civilization, the story exploded into headlines. Newspapers called her the female Robinson Crusoe. Reporters wanted details, wanted drama, wanted a heroic tale they could sell to readers hungry for Arctic adventure. But Ada Blackjack wanted none of it. She said more than once that she had simply done what she had to do to survive and to get back to her son. She wasn't chasing glory. She was trying to come home. Some of the press coverage turned cruel, even accusing her of failing to do enough to save the men who died, ignoring the fact that she had nursed one of them for months and had no possible way to save the 3 who vanished into the ice on their own decision. She faced criticism that no one would have leveled at a man who had done exactly what she did. It's a bitter footnote to an already brutal story that surviving wasn't enough to escape judgment. She used the money she was eventually paid, and money raised afterward, to get Bennett the medical treatment he needed. She spent the rest of her life largely out of the public eye, working various jobs, raising her son, living a life that rarely resembled the dramatic headlines that had once carried her name across the country. She passed away in 1983 in Palmer, Alaska, at the age of 85. For decades, her story faded from public memory, overshadowed by the men who organized the expedition and by the mystery of the 3 who disappeared on the ice. It's only in recent years, through books and renewed historical interest, that Ada Blackjack has finally started receiving the recognition her survival deserves. Think about what she actually did. She wasn't trained for the Arctic. She wasn't an explorer by trade or ambition. She was a young mother who took a difficult job because she needed money for her sick child, and she ended up outliving 4 trained, capable young men on one of the harshest, most unforgiving stretches of land on the planet. She nursed a dying man with no medicine and no help. She survived alone for months afterward, teaching herself skills that most people spend a lifetime mastering, driven by nothing but the will to see her son again. There's no dramatic twist ending here, no final confrontation, no rescue at the last possible second. Just a woman who refused to stop trying day after day in conditions that had already claimed 4 other lives. Ada Blackjack never called herself a hero. Maybe that's exactly why she was one. If this story moved you, hit subscribe for more real accounts of ordinary people who survive the impossible, and drop a comment telling me who you think deserves to be remembered next.